In the name of love, a woman commits a hateful act.
Rarely is a woman the participant in that activity.
Hungry for fame, a small-town girl goes out with a bang.
Using the ultimate weapon, sex appeal.
And a bored housewife sides with the devil to save her reputation.
They come up with something mind-blowing in terms of callous brutality.
People are drawn to the tiny virgin island of St. John for many reasons. For wealthy widow and failed actress, 37-year-old Amanda Perry, it's a new start.
She was very disillusioned. She never got a decent role. And finally, she pretty much gave up on that dream. She went off on vacation to St. John. And she decided that was where she wanted to live.
For 30-year-old musician Grant Hayes, the holiday mecca of St. John is a chance to boost his career.
Grant was a kind of a local star, so to speak, down there. Part of Grant's charm was his guitar.
Hey, mojito?
And he seemed to use that to his advantage, especially when it came to the women in his life.
I mean, what can I say? I'm a fan, you know.
She just fell for that gorgeous smile and that wonderful charisma, and she wanted to get to know him better.
Maybe you could teach me a chord or two.
Sure, we can work something out.
Yeah.
It could be the perfect match with a shared love of performing and dreams of the big time.
Grant was an aspiring blues musician, but it never got past the aspiring stage.
Grant has more charm than money, so a wealthy woman's attention is welcome. After all, he has mouths to feed back home.
Grant was a Lothario. He loved women, and he felt like he could charm just about any woman he met.
Hey, good morning.
Hey.
It smells good.
Amanda falls hard for Mr. Charm. Even the fact that he has a family and an ex-wife doesn't faze her.
Hey, how's our boy?
Much better.
Thank God for that.
But in truth, there's nothing ex about Grant's wife. 25-year-old Laura Ackerson. She's raising their 2 young boys in Kingston, North Carolina, waiting for Grant to come home.
It's ready. Who is that?
Oh, that's just an investor helping me with something.
Really?
Yeah, really. Look, I've got to go, all right?
He tells Laura that he met a new investor, but Laura kind of thinks there's something more going on after a while, but she doesn't push it.
My crazy ex.
Oh, really? Well, she's got herself some competition now.
He was pretty charming, and she pretty quickly developed a relationship with him.
Want breakfast?
Yeah, sure.
These lovebirds won't be slowed by old baggage. It's full steam ahead.
Flew out to Las Vegas, where Amanda
Busy.
And it just went downhill and got worse and worse and worse.
Grant files for full custody of their children.
Cut it out!
the psychologist came in and actually laid out what was really going on.
I told you we had a special guest coming. If you're not gonna play nice, no one gets the toy.
Boys, am I right? I go super fast.
was clear from what she wrote that the boys were safer and in a more stable environment when they were with Laura.
It seems Laura will win.
Grant became to realize that he wasn't going to get full custody of the children. That just threw a huge kink in their plans.
I think for Amanda, there was a lot more emotion behind it in Grant's mind.
Damn it!
In 2011, in Raleigh, North Carolina, bad news isn't sitting well with Grant and Amanda Perry.
It's not good.
They'll have to share custody of Grant's children with his ex, Laura.
It appears to me that Grant didn't want Laura in his life. He wanted full custody of the children and to live in New York, where he could pursue his dream.
What are you gonna do?
You know what I have to do.
And together, everything was together from that point forward.
Amanda and Grant make an offer Laura can't refuse.
And when he asked her if she'd like to have a midweek visit, she jumped at the chance because she just loved to see her boys as much as she could.
She's coming in 30 minutes. You gonna be ready?
Yeah, I'm gonna be ready.
Laura had no idea what she was in for.
Oh, hi. This is a pleasant surprise. Where are they?
From the very beginning to the very end, I think they worked as a team to annihilate Laura.
For Amanda, it was more female jealousy. I want you dead. I want you out of my husband's and my life. And that's what happened.
On July 13th, 2011, Laura is lured to her death by motherly love.
Her life revolved around her children. That was the one thing that kind of stood out about her. That's who she was more than anything, was a mom.
Amanda and Grant now have what they want if they can get away with murder.
What happened after this murder is what will just rock your world. I don't even like thinking about what went on in the bathroom of that apartment. Laura's body was cut into pieces and packed away in coolers. How could anyone even think about that, much less do it?
With body parts packed in coolers, the killers embark on a road trip. Destination, a sprawling property in Texas, owned by Amanda's sister.
They asked Amanda's sister if there were alligators out back in the canal area. Why would they do that?
So late one night, they went out in a boat and they dumped those body parts into the water and hoped the alligators finished it all.
The amount of disrespect that was shown to Laura Ackerson is phenomenal. They completely disrespected her humanness, her life.
Their macabre endeavors will only get Grant and Amanda so far. Laura has people who love her, and she's soon reported missing.
We got a search warrant for Amanda's apartment. The thing I remember about going in that first time, this large bleach stain on the floor when you walk in. And you get this odor of bleach when you walk in. So you are evil, evil women, just like there are evil, evil men out there.
She wanted a good time. That's what she did best. What could go wrong?
Like many teenagers, 16-year-old Beulah May Sheriff likes to get what she wants.
Her beauty was her currency. She was a beautiful young girl. Everyone told her how beautiful she was and thought that would get her everything she wanted in life.
But in rural Kentucky, at the turn of the 20th century, beauty only gets you so far.
Girl! Girl, you get back here now!
Catch me if you can!
She wanted to move to the big city and marry a rich guy.
And she believes she should be the wife of a wealthy man. She should be a famous cabaret singer or actress.
But after eloping, her first husband falls short.
How can you just ignore him?
Linotype operator Perry Stevens provides a child, but their new life is a long way from city glamour.
No. No, thank you. I just got changed.
She didn't like being a mother at all.
I'm going out.
She would leave her husband with the baby, and she would go out and party, drink, dance.
Unbelievable.
Oh, you better believe it.
Her husband very wisely advised her, you're never going to be a good mother, so why don't you just leave now?
You're no mother. Don't bother coming back.
Fine by me.
There are skid marks left from her getting out of there so fast.
She didn't want to have to get a job. And so what do?
Al works hard to give his wife the good life, but soon that won't be enough.
Honey? Are you home?
How do I look?
Amazing. What's for dinner?
I was thinking we could go out.
Nah, I'm dog tired.
Well, I'm bored. Oh, this is my favorite!
It's not long before Beulah finds a new playmate. Laundromat manager, 29-year-old Harry Kalstedt.
And the two of them together, when they start drinking,
Look like you need it.
Now the good time girl has what she wants. A doting husband bringing in the money, and a secret lover to help her spend it.
while Al is at work, busting his hump, a mechanic.
Hi.
Beulah and Harry are at the house, drinking moonshine, having sex. That need for excitement is fulfilled in the secrecy involved in the affair. That gives her sort of a high.
Beulah is living the dream, at least her dream. At just 25, the world revolves around her. What more could she want?
This party that they have is going to end in a bloodbath.
Chicago, in the roaring 20s, tests America's moral core as young beauties like Beulah Annan enjoy smashing traditional roles. Not content with a doting husband, she's taken a lover, Harry Kalstedt. But now it's his turn to feel Beulah's wrath.
Beulah was disenchanted with Harry. All he wanted to do was sit around her apartment, drink wine, and have sex.
You've had enough.
Oh, I paid for it.
Well, what's a few dollars between friends?
Beulah needs more than personal attention. She wants financial attention, too.
She begins to question Harry.
There's another man.
She wants to hurt him. The best way she can think of to do that, she tells him that she has another man, a man who treats her better than he does.
What man?
Oh, he's a real Southern gentleman. Knows how to treat a woman.
Well, how many men do you need?
How dare you?
Harry could see things were going and didn't want anything to do with it.
Okay. Party's over.
He said it was over. He turned his back to her and started to walk out the door.
Her threat backfires. But in her world, no one gets to leave but Beulah.
She shot him in the back.
It's a fatal wound, but it takes time.
Beulah may have lost her dance partner, but that doesn't mean she was going to stop dancing.
She's dancing to his death. That's what she's doing. It takes him 3 hours to die. Harry's light just slowly fades over that afternoon as Beulah listens to a jazz record and enjoys his death.
Finally, when it was clear that he had died, she realized she needed a story.
Al, I've been attacked. He tried to have his way with me.
Please help me, Al. Come now.
Beulah!
I'm so terrified.
It's okay.
Beulah convinces her husband, but the police are harder to persuade.
He kept coming towards me, and so I shot him.
She told them she shot him when he was rushing at her.
In the back.
Well, it was self-defense.
It was pointed out to her the bullet hole was in the back of Harry. But that didn't stop her from singing that song.
When Beulah is charged with murder, she becomes an instant sensation.
Beulah was on the front page of every newspaper for a few weeks after her arrest. She was a celebrity.
What do you think of all the public support?
Everyone's been so kind. I mean...
Murder gets her the attention she's always wanted.
Beulah was not an intellectual genius, but she did know how to play up what she had and how to get the press to follow her like a puppy.
I'm just so fortunate to have my husband's full love and support.
With her faithful husband standing by her, Beulah's looking more like a wronged woman than a killer.
But what if you're found guilty?
Oh, but I can't be.
Then she plays her trump card.
I'm with child.
And so she decided that she was pregnant. And this had exactly the impact that she was hoping. The newspapers went into overdrive.
Really?
Oh my goodness.
We're going to be such wonderful parents.
A baby? We can't have a baby being born in prison. This is not acceptable.
In those days, juries were made up of all men, so the chances that all 12 of them were going to find her guilty were slim.
Beulah Annan always gets what she wants. And in 1924, she's acquitted of all charges and set free.
Beulah was so happy the all-male jury acquitted her in less than 2 hours. She shook hands with most of them and kissed one of them right on the lips. While Beulah was kissing the jurors, Lady Justice was crying.
There was not justice for Harry Kalstead. That's certainly true.
And the faithful husband who stood by her through thick and thin.
No one would know you're having a baby. Why?
The day after that, she announced she was going to divorce Al.
Beulah couldn't move fast enough to get away from Al. And the baby never happened.
Beulah plays her husband, the press, and the law like a maestro. Next stop, Hollywood. But as it goes in popular culture, Beulah's 15 minutes is up.
She expected it to just come to her, and it didn't. The press moved on. She was left with nothing.
Beulah's run of luck comes to an end, and it's left for nature to do what justice couldn't.
She contracted tuberculosis. She only lived 4 to 5 more years.
On March 14th, 1929, Beulah dies alone, age 32.
Beulah cared about Beulah. There's no evidence to suggest that she ever truly cared about anyone else.
Even in death, Beulah gets what she wants: a career in show business.
If this story sounds familiar, it's because Beulah was immortalized forever as the glamorous Roxy Hart of the musical Chicago. If there is an afterlife, Beulah's smiling.
Thought you'd never get home.
From the outside looking in, both couples seemed happy, but everyone was wrong. This case is of biblical proportions.
Coleraine, Northern Ireland, 1990. Between the sermons and the Psalms, 31-year-old Colin Howell falls for a fellow parishioner.
Colin Howell was a very successful dentist, outwardly respectable, pillar of the community.
28-year-old Hazel Buchanan can't believe her luck. There's only one complication. They're already committed.
She loved her husband, and she was a dutiful wife. Suddenly, along comes this guy called Colin Howell, and everything changed.
Colin's wife, 31-year-old Leslie, and Hazel's 32-year-old husband, Trevor, suspect nothing. Hazel soon finds innocent ways to meet up with the handsome dentist.
All right, I'm gonna be off.
Okay, bye.
All right.
You never know what attracts one person to another. But in this case, there was a very powerful spark.
The arrangement suits Colin perfectly.
Not so much.
Colin Howell led a double life. He was a lay preacher in his Baptist church where Hazel went to. He was outwardly respectable, family man, but he was sexually voracious. He was a walking contradiction, and as they say in Ulster, they say, the bigger the Bible, the bigger the hypocrite.
They were seen by another church member in the park.
What's going on here?
And were confronted.
Please, let me explain. Explain it to the pastor.
He said, "This can't go. This can't persist. You have to report this not only to the church elders, but to your spouses." And relaxation.
He knocked Hazel out with gas, and he had sex while she was unconscious. That's the kind of character he was, you know.
Dirty word. It's a word that it's not part of their vocabulary.
Trevor and I'd be better off if we died in a car crash.
Colin got the idea quite accidentally from his own wife, Leslie.
They come up with something mind-blowing in terms of callous brutality.
Divorce, in the eyes of God, is a perpetual sin that will exist until the day they die, and they'll never get into the kingdom of heaven. But murder, that was okay.
What if we get caught?
Trapped in their own passionless marriages,
We won't.
lovers Hazel Buchanan and Colin Howell search for a way out.
And he said to her, "You know, I have an idea. Why don't we kill Trevor and Leslie, and we can be together?"
On May 18th, 1991, they're ready.
Colin decided he had to kill his wife first. So he plied her with a little alcohol.
The plan is to gas Leslie so she stays asleep forever.
He connects the hose pipe to the exhaust, turns the ignition, and he waits.
And as the exhaust began to fill the area, she began to arouse because the smell from the combustion of the gasoline was irritating. And as she aroused, her husband rushes back into the room and pulls the quilt over her head and holds her down.
Till eventually, she goes limp, and there's nothing there.
A few streets away,
Help you sleep.
Hazel helps husband Trevor prepare for bed.
Thank you.
All right.
She gave him temazepam. She made sure that he had a good dose of this sleeping pill in his system.
Because now it's Trevor's turn. Colin is ready for murder, round 2.
He does the exact same thing. He runs the hose through the house, switches the ignition on, and waits for the fumes to start emit from the other end of the hose.
Just like Leslie, the fumes arouse Trevor.
He jumps on top of him and he sticks the hose into Trevor's mouth. And she can hear all of this. She can hear her husband fighting for his life. But she says nothing. She says absolutely nothing.
In one night, 2 loving parents are taken away in the prime of their lives.
2 people who had the hots for each other not only felt okay with murder, but they took the parents away of 6 young children.
Turned on her music maker.
A hose pipe finishes the illusion.
It was the perfect murder.
The case is closed, and the lovers have their new life ahead of them. But the price they've paid will gradually make its claim.
What do you think's going to happen to a relationship where you're sleeping next to someone that you know is capable of murdering their partner? You're next?
It lasted for what, 5 years? Never worked out.
Now the pair are bonded, not by love, but by a deadly secret. They move on to new marriages. Hazel becomes Mrs. Stewart, but they all remain in the church. Still, it doesn't erase the guilt, at least for Colin. 18 years after the murders, his conscience wins.
Killed my wife first.
One day, he walked into a police station and told the whole story.
And the whole plot came to the fore, that this was murder, fiendishly plotted murder.
Hazel didn't go down so easily. She didn't want to come clean.
But it doesn't matter.
The evidence all pointed in one direction, complicity.
He's deadly.
The night begins with red and blue lights slicing through the dark, a routine traffic stop on an empty Midwest highway, the kind of moment that barely registers on the evening news, the kind of moment that happens 1,000 times a day. Except this one doesn't end with a warning or a ticket. It ends with a name whispered into a police radio, a name that has been sitting in a cold case file for years, collecting dust, waiting, a name that was never supposed to surface again, and as the officer stands there with the wind cutting across the asphalt and the engine ticking as it cools, no one yet understands that this brief pause on the roadside is about to tear open a wound the community tried to forget. For decades, the Midwest town had been defined by its silences, wide streets, modest houses, front porches that creaked in the summer heat, and a belief that terrible things happened somewhere else, not here. Not among people who waved at each other at grocery stores and shared coffee after church, but that belief shattered the day one of their own vanished. A disappearance so sudden and clean it felt unreal. A person swallowed by the ordinary rhythm of life with no scream. No struggle, no. Witnesses willing to speak. Just an empty space where someone used to be, a cold case born not from chaos, but from stillness. The victim was known, not famous, not notorious, just familiar, the kind of person whose routines were predictable, whose absence was immediately noticed, whose name echoed across phone calls and kitchen tables when they didn't come home. When their car wasn't where it should be, when the hours stretched into days and the searchlights swept across fields and ditches and wooded edges with nothing to show for it. No body, no blood, no broken glass, only questions piling up faster than answers. Investigators arrived with urgency, notebooks filling with timelines and statements, patrol cars circling the same blocks again and again. But the town resisted the idea that something violent had happened. Neighbors insisted they heard nothing, saw nothing, remembered nothing unusual, and every door knocked on seemed to close gently but firmly, the kind of closure that leaves no mark but stops progress cold, and slowly, inevitably, the case slid from breaking news to background noise, from active investigation to a file-stamped cold case. Years passed, and with them came new families, new storefronts, new reasons to talk about something else. But the absence lingered, a shadow that followed anniversaries and quiet evenings, a name spoken softly, a face still pinned to old bulletin boards. A mystery that refused to resolve itself, and in the police department, the file remained, thick with reports, thin with conclusions, revisited occasionally, almost ritualistically, by detectives who hoped fresh eyes might see what others missed. The problem was never a lack of theories, it was an excess of them, rumors that twisted through the town like smoke, whispers about secret affairs, arguments that got out of hand, strangers passing through, familiar faces hiding dark sides, but nothing solid enough to hold, nothing that could survive the scrutiny of evidence, and each lead collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind only the same unanswered question: how does someone vanish without leaving a trace? Time became the enemy. Witnesses moved away or passed on, memories blurred, physical evidence degraded or disappeared entirely, and the case hardened into something untouchable, a story told to newcomers as a warning, as a curiosity, as a reminder that even here, even in this quiet place, something went wrong, something never fixed, and law enforcement learned to live with the discomfort of not knowing. Then, on a night like any other, a car drifted slightly over the center line, enough to justify a stop, enough to trigger protocol. The officer approached with the same practiced caution used 100 times before, flashlight cutting through the interior. Eyes scanning hands, dashboard, back seat, and in that brief exchange of documents and questions, a detail surfaced, a name spoken casually, almost carelessly, that matched something buried deep in a database, a name that caused a pause just long enough to matter. Dispatch confirmed it, a flag on the system, an old entry tied to a cold case no one expected to see again, and suddenly the air changed, routine transformed into tension. The officer unaware of the full weight of what they were holding back with calm professionalism, while somewhere miles away, the past stirred, and a case file that hadn't been touched in years was pulled from a shelf. The suspect didn't look like a monster. They rarely do. They looked ordinary, tired even, someone who had lived quietly, blended in, paid bills, attended events, shared jokes, all while carrying something unseen, and as questions deepened and records were checked, a pattern began to emerge, not clear enough to convict, not yet, but sharp enough to cut through complacency, a series of coincidences that aligned too neatly to ignore. Detectives returned to the beginning, retracing steps with a new lens, re-examining statements once dismissed as irrelevant, looking again at timelines that now felt flexible, and slowly, methodically, the cold case warmed, not with certainty, but with possibility, the dangerous kind that raises hopes and threatens to break them all over again. They found inconsistencies that hadn't mattered before, a gap in alibis, a forgotten argument, a vehicle description that suddenly matched, a phone record that now seemed louder than silence. And each discovery pushed against the narrative the town had built to protect itself, the story that nothing like this could happen here, that the truth was unknowable, that the past was best left buried. As investigators pressed forward, the suspect's past unraveled, Small details accumulating into something heavier, something harder to dismiss, and the community felt it before it understood it, an unease spreading through conversations. A recognition that the case everyone thought was closed by time was not finished at all, that the answers they never had might be closer than anyone wanted. Yet, even as the evidence mounted, uncertainty remained, because cold cases don't resolve cleanly. They resist closure, they demand patience and exactness, and every step forward risked reopening wounds, reviving accusations, and forcing people to confront the possibility that the danger was never outside, never unknown, but familiar, hiding in plain sight. The routine traffic stop that started it all faded from memory as the investigation gained momentum, but its significance lingered, a reminder that chance, not justice, had finally shifted the balance. That the truth sometimes surfaces not through brilliance or confession, but through randomness, through a small mistake made years too late. And as the town waited, caught between hope and dread, the cold case sat on the edge of transformation, no longer frozen, not yet solved, suspended in a tense moment where every new discovery felt like a shockwave, every unanswered question echoed louder. And the name once whispered in fear now hovered over everything, threatening to expose not just a killer, but a past the community was never prepared to face. By the time the sun rose, the town was already buzzing, not openly, not loudly, but in the way small places react when something shifts beneath the surface, when people sense that an old story is moving again, that a cold case once sealed by time has been disturbed. And inside the police department the air felt heavier, phones ringing with cautious inquiries, officers exchanging looks that said more than words, the past no longer content to stay buried. The suspect was brought in quietly, no sirens, no spectacle, just paperwork and procedure, the kind of restraint that suggests uncertainty rather than triumph, because even now nothing was proven, only suggested. Only hinted at by data points and coincidences that had finally aligned, and as detectives began the interview, they understood the stakes. One wrong move could collapse years of fragile progress. One misstep could turn possibility back into silence. The room was plain, fluorescent lights humming softly, a recorder placed between two chairs, and the suspect sat with an expression that revealed nothing, not fear, not guilt, not relief, only a practiced calm that comes from years of not being questioned. Years of believing the moment would never arrive, and when the first questions were asked, they answered easily, smoothly, with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this scenario in their head countless times. They spoke of routines, of work schedules, of ordinary days that blurred together, and at first nothing stood out, no confession, no contradiction, just a steady stream of normality, but detectives listened differently now. They weren't searching for a dramatic reveal, they were listening for fractures, for pauses, for moments where memory stumbled, and slowly those moments appeared, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. Outside the station, the community began to connect dots of its own, recognizing the name circulating through hushed conversations, recalling past interactions, re-examining shared memories with a new unease. The realization creeping in that familiarity is not protection, that knowing someone does not mean knowing what they're capable of, and this collective reprocessing of the past sent ripples through the town, altering how people saw each other. Investigators turned to physical evidence next, what little remained, items logged and stored years ago, thought insignificant at the time, now scrutinized under modern techniques, and the results weren't definitive, not yet, but they were suggestive. Enough to warrant deeper analysis, enough to justify warrants and searches that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. When they searched the suspect's property, they moved carefully, aware that expectation can distort perception, that finding nothing can be just as telling as finding something, and what they discovered was not a clear smoking gun, not a body or a weapon, but fragments, traces of behavior, inconsistencies between what was said and what could be verified, a timeline that didn't quite align, a location that had been visited more than once without a convincing explanation. Each discovery tightened the focus, narrowing the field of possibilities, and as pressure mounted, the suspect's composure began to shift, answers growing shorter, irritation seeping into tone, the cracks widening just enough to glimpse what lay beneath. And detectives pressed gently, methodically, allowing silence to do the work, letting unanswered questions hang until they demanded response. The case reached back into old witness statements, people once deemed unreliable or mistaken, and suddenly their accounts felt different, not wrong, just incomplete, missing context that now existed, and investigators began recontacting them, finding some reluctant, some eager, some visibly shaken by the idea that what they'd dismissed years ago might have mattered after all. One witness remembered a vehicle parked where it didn't belong, another recalled an argument overheard but forgotten, another admitted to seeing the suspect near the victim's last known location. Details once shrugged off as coincidence now felt heavier, more deliberate, and with each corroboration, the narrative shifted from mystery to menace. The media caught wind of the renewed investigation, headlines hinting at movement in a long-dormant cold case, careful not to declare victory, but unable to resist the drama of resurrection, and cameras appeared at the edge of town. Reporters speaking in measured tones about justice delayed, about answers finally emerging, even as law enforcement refused to confirm anything beyond ongoing inquiry. Inside the department, the tension was constant, a mix of cautious optimism and professional dread, because cold cases don't just expose perpetrators, they expose failures, missed opportunities, assumptions made under pressure. And detectives knew that solving this case would also mean confronting what had gone wrong the first time, what signs had been overlooked, what voices had been ignored. As questioning continued, the suspect was confronted with contradictions, presented with evidence piece by piece, and their responses grew strained, not explosive, but defensive, a shift that seasoned investigators recognized as significant. The slow erosion of certainty, the realization that the story they'd been telling themselves for years might no longer hold. Yet even now, even with momentum building, the truth remained elusive, wrapped in half-answers and circumstantial threads, and the town waited, suspended between revelation and disappointment, aware that a cold case warming doesn't guarantee resolution. That exposure doesn't always lead to closure. Night fell again, and with it came the weight of anticipation, lights burning late in offices where files lay open and timelines sprawled across walls, detectives piecing together a picture that was still incomplete, still fragile, but unmistakably darker than anyone had imagined. And somewhere in that quiet Midwest town, people lay awake, replaying memories, wondering how close they'd been to something terrible without ever realizing it. As the cold case edged closer to a truth that promised to change everything, even if it never fully explained why. Morning brought no relief, only a sharper kind of pressure, the sense that something irreversible was underway, and inside the investigation the pace quickened, not because answers were suddenly clear, but because time itself felt hostile. Every hour another chance for doubt to creep in, for evidence to weaken, for the story to fracture under scrutiny. Detectives gathered around tables layered with maps and photographs, the victim's final known movements traced and retraced, the suspect's life laid out in parallel, two timelines running close enough to touch, overlapping in places that now seemed impossible to dismiss. What had once looked like coincidence began to resemble choreography, subtle, deliberate, a series of small decisions that placed the suspect exactly where they needed to be without drawing attention, and the more investigators studied it, the more unsettling it became, because nothing about it was dramatic, nothing screamed violence, it was ordinary behavior masking extraordinary consequence. This was not chaos, it was control, and that realization shifted the tone of the case, turning curiosity into something colder, something more deliberate. They revisited the last confirmed sighting of the victim, a mundane moment captured in a blurry security image, the kind of footage that barely earns a second glance, a person moving through a familiar space. Unaware it would be the final record of their existence, and detectives lingered on it now, studying posture, direction, timing, searching for meaning in pixels and shadows, wondering who else might have been just outside the frame. From there, attention turned to geography, to back roads and secondary routes, to places rarely visited but easily accessed, fields that stretch on without witnesses, waterways that absorb secrets without protest, and as search teams returned to these locations, technology enhanced what human eyes once missed, scans revealing disturbances in soil, anomalies beneath the surface, hints that something had been altered long ago and left to settle back into place. Each alert raised expectations, and each excavation brought tension, but results were inconsistent, traces without conclusions, evidence that suggested activity without confirming outcome, and with every near miss, frustration grew. Because the closer they seemed to get, the more the truth retreated, as if resisting exposure, as if the land itself had learned to keep quiet. The suspect, meanwhile, remained in a state of controlled unease, released but not forgotten, moving through daily life under a shadow they could feel even if others pretended not to notice, and those closest to them began to sense the shift, the guarded conversations. The sudden changes in routine, the way normal interactions carried an undercurrent of fear, because suspicion has a way of leaking into everything, contaminating even the most innocent exchanges. Investigators monitored from a distance, watching for slips, for behaviors inconsistent with innocence, and they found them, subtle but telling, a reluctance to revisit certain locations, a fixation on details that hadn't been disclosed publicly. Questions asked that revealed more knowledge than should have been possible, and each observation was logged, catalogued, weighed against the growing mass of circumstantial evidence. The cold case task force expanded, bringing in analysts who had no memory of the original investigation, no emotional investment in past assumptions, and they approached the file with ruthless neutrality, challenging narratives others had accepted, asking why certain leads were dropped, why certain witnesses were discounted, and their questions were uncomfortable because they exposed how easily urgency can harden into certainty, how quickly an investigation can narrow its own vision. One revelation stood out, a call placed years ago, brief, easily overlooked, made from a location that now aligned with the suspect's movements, and at the time it meant nothing, just another data point lost among thousands, but now it glowed with significance. A signal from the past that refused to stay silent, and when cross-referenced with other records, it formed a pattern too precise to ignore. That pattern led back to the night of the disappearance, to hours that had never been fully accounted for, and detectives began reconstructing it minute by minute, testing scenarios, discarding implausible ones, and slowly. A version of events emerged that was both simple and horrifying, not built on rage or impulse, but on opportunity, familiarity, and the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough to see. As this reconstruction took shape, the town's mood darkened, the novelty of renewed attention replaced by dread, because answers bring consequences, and consequences have names and faces, and people began to understand that if the case moved forward, it would not just identify a suspect, it would indict a collective failure to notice, to question, to protect. Families locked doors earlier, conversations grew shorter, trust thinned, and the idea that the past was settled dissolved entirely, replaced by the realization that the worst moments don't always announce themselves. They blend in, they wait, and they leave damage that spreads quietly across generations. Legal considerations entered the conversation, prosecutors advising caution, reminding investigators that suspicion is not proof, that cold cases demand standards even higher than fresh ones, because memory fades and defense strategies sharpen. And every piece of evidence would be challenged, every assumption attacked, and the burden of certainty would be unforgiving. That pressure weighed heavily, but it did not slow the work, it refined it, forcing precision, discipline, a relentless attention to detail, and as the case advanced, the question shifted from whether something terrible had happened to whether it could be proven beyond doubt, whether truth could survive the distance of years. Then came a development no one expected. A witness who had stayed silent stepped forward, not out of courage, but exhaustion, carrying a secret that had grown heavier with time, and their account didn't offer closure, it offered complication. A version of events that conflicted with established theories while reinforcing the central suspicion, and suddenly the narrative fractured again, branching into possibilities that were harder, darker, more disturbing. This testimony introduced doubt not about guilt, but about method, about motive, about what had really occurred once the victim vanished from sight, and investigators realized that solving the case might not bring the clarity everyone hoped for. That answers could deepen the horror rather than resolve it. As night fell, files remained open, lights stayed on, and the sense of inevitability grew, because cold cases don't thaw gently, they crack, and when they do, the sound carries far, echoing through communities that believed they were safe, through institutions that believed they had done enough, and through lives that were about to be redefined by a truth that had waited patiently for the right moment to emerge, incomplete, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. The witness spoke in fragments, memories worn thin by time, pauses stretching longer than words, and detectives leaned in not to interrupt, but to absorb the weight of what was being offered, because this wasn't a confession or a revelation meant to shock. It was something quieter and more corrosive, an admission of proximity, of being close enough to sense that something was wrong and choosing, for reasons never fully articulated, to step away and let the moment pass. That choice, made in seconds years ago, now sat between everyone in the room like an object too heavy to move. They described the atmosphere of that night, the way it felt charged without explanation, the suspect's behavior slightly off, not frantic, not violent, just focused in a way that drew attention without inviting questions, and as the account unfolded, investigators felt the narrative tighten, because it aligned with the emerging pattern, not contradicting it, but complicating it, adding texture where before there had only been outline. This testimony reopened old wounds, forcing the department to confront not just what might have happened, but how many opportunities there had been to intervene, to ask one more question, to follow one more instinct, and as those moments stacked up, the case transformed from a singular act into a chain of failures, each small on its own, devastating in combination. The suspect was called back in, this time with a different energy in the room, less tentative, more deliberate, the questions sharper, the pauses heavier, and though the suspect maintained composure, something had shifted. The confidence eroded by the realization that the past was no longer static, that people they'd assumed would remain silent were finding their voices. Confronted with the witness's account, the suspect denied nothing directly, instead redirecting, reframing, minimizing, a strategy that worked only until it didn't, because deflection leaves traces, and detectives noted every change in tone. Every deviation from earlier statements, the story subtly reshaping itself under pressure, a living thing trying to survive exposure. Outside, the town's patience wore thin, rumors accelerating faster than facts, names circulating without confirmation, reputations fraying, and the emotional cost mounted, especially for those connected to the victim, who were forced to relive the loss not as a distant memory, but as an active, evolving crisis, hope and fear tangled together in a way that offered no relief. Search efforts intensified again, this time guided by refined timelines and the witnesses' recollections, focusing on areas previously dismissed as unlikely, and teams worked methodically, aware that discovery could come at any moment or not at all. Because absence is the cold case investigator's constant companion, and even the most promising lead can dissolve into nothing under the weight of reality. They found objects that raised questions, items that didn't belong where they were discovered, evidence of movement and concealment, but still no definitive answer, no single moment that could be pointed to and declared the truth. And this ambiguity gnawed at everyone involved, because it allowed doubt to persist, allowed alternative explanations to survive just long enough to undermine certainty. Legal strategy became unavoidable, prosecutors weighing the strength of the case, debating whether the accumulation of circumstantial evidence could withstand cross-examination, whether a jury could be convinced without the clarity of physical proof. And these discussions were tense, because waiting risked losing momentum, but moving too soon risked collapse. The suspect's life continued under scrutiny, every action interpreted, every interaction observed, and the strain showed, relationships deteriorating, Routines disrupted, the quiet confidence replaced by vigilance, because even without charges, suspicion is a sentence of its own, isolating, relentless, and impossible to appeal. Investigators noticed changes, increased agitation, attempts to control the narrative through indirect means, comments made to acquaintances that echoed investigative language too closely, slips that suggested an awareness of details not publicly known. And each of these moments was catalogued, building a psychological profile that pointed toward guilt without ever quite crossing into proof. Meanwhile, the cold case file grew heavier, not with answers, but with complexity, layers of interpretation stacked atop years of silence, and detectives began to understand that even if the case reached court, even if a verdict was delivered, the story would never be simple, never clean, because too much time had passed, too many truths had decayed. As weeks turned into months, the urgency shifted from discovery to decision. The question no longer what happened, but what could be demonstrated. And this distinction mattered, because justice operates on evidence, not intuition. And the gap between those two widened with every passing day. The community felt the strain acutely, caught between wanting resolution and fearing its cost, because closure doesn't just end stories, it exposes them, revealing uncomfortable realities about trust, about proximity, about how easily danger can hide within normalcy, and this awareness altered the town's identity in ways that couldn't be undone. Late one evening, as investigators reviewed the latest findings, a realization settled in quietly but firmly that the case had reached a point of no return, that whether or not it resulted in an arrest, the truth had already begun to surface, reshaping memories, reassigning blame, and forcing a reckoning with a past that refused to stay buried. The cold case was no longer just an unsolved mystery, it was an active presence, influencing decisions, altering lives, demanding attention, and as the investigation pressed forward into uncertain territory, one thing became clear: that whatever happened next would not restore what was lost, would not erase the years of absence and doubt, but it would leave a mark just as permanent, a reminder that some wounds reopen not to heal, but to be acknowledged, and that the silence they replace can be just as unsettling as the truth itself. The pressure finally forced a choice, not dramatic, not announced, but made quietly in conference rooms where voices stayed low and words were chosen carefully, because this was the moment every cold case reaches sooner or later. The line between pursuit and prosecution, between knowing and proving, and as the decision took shape, investigators felt the weight of it settle in their chests, heavy and irreversible. They would move forward, not because the case was perfect, not because every question had been answered, but because waiting any longer meant surrendering to time, and time had already taken too much. The suspect was informed without ceremony, no handcuffs yet, just a formal notice, the law asserting itself through language and implication, and the reaction was telling not for its drama, but for its restraint, a tightening of the jaw. A brief flicker of something like calculation, followed by a return to composure, as if the next steps had already been imagined. That reaction echoed through the investigation, confirming what many had begun to suspect, that this was not a person caught off guard, but one who had lived alongside the risk for years. Defense attorneys entered the picture immediately, experienced, precise, and ruthless in their assessment, identifying weaknesses before anyone else could, challenging timelines, questioning witnesses, framing memory as unreliable and coincidence as coincidence, and their presence altered the tone of everything, because from that moment on, the case was no longer about discovery, it was about survival, about whether truth could withstand the machinery designed to dismantle it. Prosecutors prepared cautiously, aware that cold cases invite skepticism, that juries are wary of stories assembled long after the fact, and they focused on coherence, not spectacle, weaving together the fragments into something that could be followed. Understood, believed. They knew they couldn't rely on a single devastating piece of evidence, so they leaned into accumulation, the slow build of probability, the idea that one coincidence can be dismissed, but many cannot. As filings became public, the community reacted with shock that felt delayed. like an echo finally catching up, because seeing the details in print made them real in a way rumors never could. Names, dates, locations, once abstract, now sat exposed on pages and screens, forcing people to confront how close the danger had been, how ordinary it looked, and that realization fractured the town's sense of itself, replacing nostalgia with suspicion. The victim's family moved through this phase with visible strain, caught between relief that something was finally happening and fear that it might still collapse, that after all this time they could be pulled back into silence again. Every development felt provisional, every promise conditional, and the years of waiting had taught them not to trust momentum, because cold cases have a way of surging forward only to stall without warning. Behind the scenes, investigators revisited the weakest points in their case, shoring them up where possible, anticipating attacks they knew were coming, and this process was exhausting, not just intellectually but emotionally. Because it required acknowledging uncertainty, admitting that some answers would never exist, that some questions would remain open no matter the outcome. The witness whose testimony had shifted the investigation faced intense scrutiny, their credibility dissected, motives questioned, memory challenged, and though they stood by their account, the pressure was immense, the cost of speaking late made painfully clear. And detectives worried not just about the case, but about the human toll of dragging the past into the present. As pretrial hearings unfolded, fragments of the story leaked out, each one triggering fresh debate, armchair analyses, and arguments that spread through social spaces and private conversations alike. People took sides, some clinging to disbelief, others convinced of guilt, and this polarization deepened the sense that the case was no longer just about what happened years ago, but about what the town believed about itself now. The suspect's behavior grew more erratic under the spotlight, not overtly criminal, but marked by defensiveness, attempts to shape perception, statements that edged close to self-incrimination without crossing the line, and investigators watched closely. Aware that stress reveals patterns that calm conceals, and those patterns often speak louder than words. Amid all this, new information surfaced unexpectedly, not decisive, but disruptive, a detail overlooked not because it was hidden, but because no one had known to look at it the right way, and this detail reframed part of the timeline. Not undermining the case, but complicating it, introducing a variable that demanded explanation. The revelation sent ripples through both teams, prosecution and defense scrambling to integrate or neutralize it, and for a moment, the outcome felt less certain than ever, the balance shifting back and forth with each interpretation, each argument, each expert opinion brought in to make sense of something that refused to settle. Through it all, the cold case continued to exert its strange gravity, pulling everyone toward it, refusing to let go, and as the process advanced toward a trial that promised answers but guaranteed nothing, one truth became impossible to ignore: that solving this case would not be a single event, not a verdict or a sentence, but a prolonged confrontation with ambiguity, responsibility, and loss. And somewhere beneath the legal language and procedural steps, beneath the headlines and speculation, the original question still pulsed, unchanged by progress or delay: what truly happened in the hours no one saw, and whether the truth, once exposed, would finally bring peace or simply replace one kind of silence with another, heavier and harder to endure. As the case edged closer to trial, the rhythm of the investigation shifted again, less frantic but more suffocating, a slow, grinding pressure that settled over everyone involved, because now every detail mattered in a different way. Every sentence destined to be replayed, dissected, doubted. Detectives stopped thinking like investigators and started thinking like witnesses, rehearsing explanations, anticipating questions designed not to uncover truth but to fracture it, and this mental pivot was unsettling, because it forced them to confront how fragile even the strongest narrative can be when exposed to adversarial light. The timeline became the battlefield, hours compressed and expanded depending on who was speaking, minutes treated as either insignificant or decisive, and experts were brought in to anchor time to something solid: phone pings, vehicle data, environmental conditions, anything that could resist reinterpretation. But time is slippery, especially years later, and even the most technical reconstructions carried margins of error large enough to exploit. The defense leaned into those gaps relentlessly, framing them as voids where reasonable doubt could flourish, emphasizing what was missing rather than what was present, and this strategy resonated with some observers, because absence feels safer than accusation. Because it's easier to accept uncertainty than to believe that someone familiar had carried a secret so dark for so long. Prosecutors countered by humanizing the victim, not sensationalizing their life or death, but restoring them to the center of the story, a reminder that this case was not an abstract exercise in probability, but a response to a real loss that had echoed through years of unanswered questions. They spoke carefully, aware that emotion can persuade but also provoke backlash, and they walked a narrow line between empathy and restraint. Behind closed doors, negotiations flickered briefly into existence, the possibility of a plea discussed and dismissed in the same breath, because neither side felt secure enough to concede, and the suspect maintained an outward refusal to bend, projecting confidence that some still mistook for innocence. But those who watched closely noticed the strain, the way certainty had hardened into rigidity, the way flexibility had vanished. The witness at the heart of the renewed investigation struggled visibly, their life appended by scrutiny, their past choices exposed under unforgiving light, and yet they persisted, driven less by a belief in justice than by an exhaustion with silence, a need to finally release something that had been carried too long. Their resolve became a quiet counterpoint to the louder legal maneuvers, a reminder of the human cost threaded through every procedural step. Media coverage intensified as trial dates loomed, language growing sharper, speculation bolder, and with each segment the story drifted further from its origins, simplified, dramatized, and in some cases distorted. And investigators worried that this external noise would bleed into the courtroom, shaping perceptions before evidence ever had the chance to speak. The town felt smaller than ever, conversations looping endlessly back to the case, trust thinning under the weight of suspicion, because when a cold case resurfaces, it doesn't just ask who did it, it asks who noticed, who ignored, who assumed someone else would act, and these questions linger uncomfortably close to home. In preparation, detectives revisited the earliest days of the disappearance one last time, not searching for new evidence, but for understanding, trying to see the case as it had been then, stripped of hindsight, and this exercise was painful, because it revealed how reasonable the initial conclusions had seemed, how easily uncertainty had been mistaken for impossibility. That realization complicated their resolve, introducing empathy not just for the victim, but for their past selves, for colleagues who had worked with limited tools and incomplete information, and it underscored a truth rarely acknowledged, that cold cases are not just failures of justice, but artifacts of their time, shaped by what was known and what was believed possible. As final motions were filed, a sense of inevitability settled in, not about outcome, but about exposure, because regardless of verdict, the case would force a reckoning with the past, with institutional limits, with the uncomfortable proximity of harm. The cold case had already done its damage, reopening wounds, reshaping narratives, and dismantling illusions of safety. On the eve of trial, the suspect sat alone for a long time, according to those who observed, not speaking, not moving, staring at nothing in particular, and that image circulated quietly among investigators, not as evidence, but as atmosphere. A symbol of the isolation that comes when a story you've lived inside for years is about to be told by others. Sleep came fitfully across the town that night, minds racing with imagined outcomes, rehearsed arguments, feared revelations, because everyone sensed that whatever happened next would linger, that the trial would not resolve the mystery so much as redefine it, translating years of silence into words that could never be taken back. And as dawn approached, the cold case stood poised at a threshold, no longer frozen, not yet settled, waiting for a judgment that promised clarity but threatened something far more unsettling, the realization that even when answers arrive, they rarely arrive whole. The courtroom filled slowly, deliberately, The way serious things begin. No rush, no noise, just the soft friction of people taking their places, each carrying a private version of the story that had brought them there, and as the proceedings opened, the weight of the cold case pressed into the room, not as history, but as a presence that demanded attention. Years of silence were about to be translated into testimony, and everyone understood that once spoken, those words would never return to where they came from. Opening statements avoided spectacle, focusing instead on sequence, on how ordinary moments can conceal extraordinary acts, and the prosecution framed the case as a pattern revealed only through patience, a truth that resisted discovery until chance and persistence converged. The defense countered with a narrative of coincidence and memory's fragility, reminding the jury that time corrodes certainty, that stories reconstructed years later are vulnerable to distortion, and that doubt is not a flaw but a safeguard. Witnesses took the stand one by one, voices steady or trembling, recounting fragments of the past that had lingered uncomfortably close, and each account added texture rather than clarity, reinforcing how incomplete any single perspective can be. The jury listened, faces unreadable, absorbing contradictions and overlaps, forced to hold multiple versions of the same moment in their minds without resolution. When the key witness testified, the room tightened, attention sharpening, because this was the hinge on which much of the case turned, and their words carried the strain of someone revisiting a choice they could never undo. They described the night again, more precisely this time, the sense of something being wrong without understanding why, the decision to step back rather than intervene, and the defense pressed hard, exposing inconsistencies, probing memory, suggesting influence and regret masquerading as truth. The exchange was tense but controlled, and as it unfolded, it became clear that this testimony was less about what the witness saw than about what they felt, a perception of danger without proof. And the jury was left to decide how much weight intuition deserves when measured against the demand for evidence. Expert testimony followed, charts and timelines projected, technical language attempting to anchor the story to something solid, and while some jurors leaned in, others looked overwhelmed. The abstraction of data colliding with the emotional gravity of the case. The experts spoke confidently, but even they acknowledged margins of error, uncertainties that could not be eliminated, only minimized. The defense seized on those admissions, weaving them into a broader argument about overreach, about the temptation to impose meaning on randomness, and this strategy resonated with the case's long dormancy, reinforcing the idea that if the truth had been clear, it would not have taken so long to emerge. Throughout it all, the suspect sat quietly, rarely reacting, a stillness that some interpreted as composure and others as calculation, and that ambiguity became part of the evidence in the public mind, though officially it meant nothing. The human tendency to read meaning into demeanor proved impossible to suppress, even among those sworn to objectivity. Outside the courtroom, the town waited, conversations looping endlessly through what had been said and what had been left unsaid, and the strain showed, patience thinning, empathy fraying, because trials demand attention without offering resolution until the end. And the end always feels impossibly far away. As the days passed, fatigue set in, and with it came mistakes, misstatements quickly corrected, objections sustained and overruled, moments that seemed trivial but could carry disproportionate weight, because in a case like this, everything is magnified. Every slip a potential crack in the narrative. The prosecution rested without fireworks, confident not in a single devastating blow, but in the cumulative effect of their case, the slow assembly of probability into something they hoped would feel inevitable. The defense followed with a restrained rebuttal, avoiding grand claims, focusing instead on the absence of certainty, on the risks of conviction built on inference. Closing arguments brought the tension to a peak, each side appealing to responsibility from opposite directions, one urging action in the face of overwhelming implication, the other urging restraint in the face of enduring doubt. And the jury was left with the task no one else could perform, to decide whether the story they had heard crossed the line from suspicion to truth. When deliberations began, the courtroom emptied, but the atmosphere remained, thick and unresolved, because the verdict, whatever it would be, could not restore what was lost, could not rewind years of absence, and as the jury retreated behind closed doors, the cold case entered its final, most fragile phase, balanced on the edge between resolution and the possibility that even now, after everything, certainty might remain just out of reach. Deliberations stretched on in silence that felt louder than testimony, hours folding into each other as the jury weighed fragments of a story that refused to settle, and inside that closed room the cold case became something intimate. No longer a public spectacle, but a private burden shared by strangers tasked with making sense of years they had never lived. Notes were read aloud, timelines reconstructed from memory, arguments rehearsed and dismantled, and still the question hovered, persistent and unresolved. Some jurors fixated on patterns, the way coincidence piled upon coincidence until it began to feel deliberate, while others returned again and again to what was missing, the absence of a body, the gaps in time that could not be filled, the possibility that chance had been mistaken for design. Each position carried its own logic, and the tension between them was not hostile but exhausted, a collective awareness that no choice would feel clean. As discussions deepened, the weight of responsibility sharpened because a verdict would not just interpret evidence, it would define the past for an entire community, and that knowledge pressed hard against every argument, every doubt, making even the smallest detail feel monumental. The jurors understood that acquittal would cement uncertainty, while conviction would lock a narrative into place forever. Outside, the town existed in a state of suspension, daily routines continuing with a strange artificiality, conversations carefully avoiding finality, because everyone sensed that the outcome would alter how the story was told from this point on. Businesses stayed open, schools ran on schedule, but beneath it all was an awareness that history was being decided a few rooms away. Inside the courthouse, attorneys waited with practiced calm, masking their own anxieties, because even the most confident strategy dissolves under deliberation, and both sides understood that once the jury withdrew, control evaporated. The suspect remained still, eyes fixed forward, posture unchanged, as if movement itself might tip the balance. Hours turned into a day, then another, and speculation intensified, media parsing every delay as meaning, every pause as indication. But the truth was simpler and more troubling, that certainty was hard to reach. That doubt persisted in places no argument could penetrate. When the jury finally returned, the room filled again with restrained anticipation, breaths held, eyes trained on faces that revealed nothing, and as the verdict was read, its language was precise, its tone neutral, but its impact rippled outward immediately, because it did not deliver the clarity many had hoped for. The decision, complex and carefully worded, acknowledged responsibility without resolving every question, offering a form of closure that felt partial, conditional, and, for some, deeply unsatisfying. It marked an end to proceedings, but not an end to uncertainty, and as reactions spread through the room, relief and disappointment coexisted uneasily, neither able to dominate. The victim's family responded with quiet resolve, not celebration, not despair, but something in between, an acceptance shaped by years of waiting, understanding that this was as close to an answer as the system could provide. The suspect absorbed the outcome without visible reaction, a stillness that lingered long after the courtroom emptied. In the days that followed, the town struggled to recalibrate, to understand what the verdict meant for them, for the story they had lived with for so long. Headlines declared resolution, but conversations told a different story, one of lingering doubt, of unanswered questions that no legal language could erase. The cold case, officially closed, continued to exist in memory and debate, its edges softened but not erased, a reminder that justice can be imperfect, that truth can arrive fractured, and that endings do not always feel like relief. As life resumed its outward normalcy, the absence at the heart of the case remained, quieter now, but no less present, shaping how the community remembered and how it would carry this story forward, incomplete, unsettling, and impossible to fully leave behind. The verdict settled into the town like a low fog, not dramatic, not explosive, but persistent, seeping into conversations, into routines, into the way people looked at one another in grocery aisles and parking lots, because now there was an official ending. And yet nothing felt finished. The cold case had been stamped closed, archived with finality, but the human mind resisted that label, replaying testimony, reimagining moments, asking questions the courtroom was no longer allowed to answer. In the weeks that followed, investigators returned to their desks with a strange mixture of relief and restlessness, the urgency gone but the unease intact, because closing a case does not erase the paths not taken, the theories left unexplored, the small decisions that might have changed everything. Files were boxed, evidence logged for long-term storage, and with each administrative step, the distance between then and now grew wider, even as the emotional residue refused to fade. The victim's name resurfaced in quieter ways, memorials updated, anniversaries acknowledged with a new tone, less desperate, more resigned, and those closest to the loss struggled to reconcile the legal outcome with the private truth they carried, because for them, closure was never about verdicts, it was about understanding, and understanding remained incomplete. Grief adapted, but it did not resolve. The suspect's presence in the community vanished almost overnight, removed by circumstance and consequence, leaving behind an absence that felt different from the one at the heart of the case, but no less disruptive. People debated what justice meant in this context, whether it had been served or merely approximated, and these debates revealed more about the town than the crime itself, exposing fault lines of trust, belief, and fear that had always been there, unnoticed. Rumors persisted, some darker than before, others softer, almost sympathetic, as narratives shifted to accommodate discomfort, and this constant reinterpretation underscored a harsh reality, that stories do not end when facts stop emerging. They evolve, reshaped by emotion and necessity, by the need to live with what cannot be changed. Law enforcement faced its own reckoning, internal reviews conducted quietly, lessons extracted cautiously, because cold cases teach slowly and expensively, and no department likes to acknowledge how easily momentum can be lost, how fragile early assumptions can become when they harden too soon. Training materials were updated, protocols revised, subtle changes that would never make headlines but might alter the outcome of some future investigation. The media moved on, as it always does, attention shifting to newer crises, fresher tragedies, and without the constant reinforcement of coverage, the case began to recede from national awareness, becoming once again a local story, a shared memory rather than a spectacle. But for those who lived it, the silence felt different now, heavier in some ways, because it was filled with knowledge that could not be unlearned. At night, the town returned to its familiar rhythms, lights dimming, streets emptying, the quiet reasserting itself, but that quiet was no longer innocent. It carried history, a reminder that normalcy can coexist with unresolved truth. People locked their doors not out of fear, but out of habit, a small behavioral shift that spoke volumes about how deeply the case had penetrated daily life. Some continued to investigate on their own, poring over public records, transcripts, timelines, convinced that the full story remained hidden just beyond reach, and while these efforts rarely produced new facts, they kept the case alive in a different form, as a puzzle that refused to stay solved. The internet became a repository for speculation, each theory gaining or losing traction with the tide of attention. Detectives occasionally received messages, tips that arrived too late to matter legally but too vivid to ignore emotionally, fragments of information that might have meant something years ago, and these moments were the hardest, because they suggested that certainty is often a function of timing rather than truth. Each tip was evaluated, documented, and ultimately set aside, reinforcing the finality of the process, even as it challenged its fairness. As seasons changed, the case slipped further into the past, but it did not disappear. It embedded itself into the town's identity, a reference point for conversations about safety, about vigilance, about the cost of assuming nothing bad could happen here. New residents learned the story in pieces, filtered through memory and opinion, a cautionary tale rather than a breaking news alert. And beneath all of this, beneath the legal closure and social adaptation, the central mystery remained subtly alive, not in facts, but in feeling, the sense that something essential was still missing, that the truth, whatever it was, had not fully surfaced. The cold case was closed, yes, but its shadow lingered, stretching across years and lives, a reminder that some answers arrive too late to heal, and some questions survive precisely because no one can say, with absolute certainty, that they have been fully answered. Time did what it always does after the noise fades. It softened edges without erasing them, and as months turned into years, the case settled into a strange afterlife, no longer active, no longer urgent, but never truly dormant. The cold case lived on in fragments, in half-remembered headlines, in the way certain names were spoken with a pause, in the subtle avoidance of specific places that had once seemed ordinary. Life moved forward, but it did so with a slight, permanent adjustment, as if the town had learned to walk with a quiet limp. For investigators, the case became a reference point, cited without explanation in training sessions, invoked as a lesson rather than a story, reminder of how randomness can reopen doors long thought sealed, and how easily certainty can dissolve under scrutiny. New recruits heard about it not as a triumph, but as a warning that answers can arrive incomplete, that closure is often a negotiated illusion, and that cold cases rarely reward those who seek clean endings. The victim's absence remained the most constant element, a space that no verdict could fill, and those who loved them adapted to a world permanently rearranged. Birthdays passed differently, holidays carried a muted undertone, and even moments of joy felt slightly compromised, because resolution did not restore what had been taken. Grief did not sharpen anymore, but it did not disappear either. It simply learned to coexist with routine. The suspect's story hardened into an official narrative, repeated often enough to feel fixed, and yet doubts persisted in the margins, whispered among those who revisited transcripts and testimony, who noticed ambiguities others preferred to ignore. These doubts did not necessarily proclaim innocence or guilt, they simply resisted finality, a refusal to let complexity be flattened into a single conclusion. Occasionally, something would stir the past again, a documentary mention, a podcast episode, a new audience encountering the case for the first time and reacting with fresh intensity, asking questions long since deemed unanswerable. Each resurgence reopened old debates, drawing the town briefly back into the spotlight, forcing it to relive decisions it had already made, and then, inevitably, attention would drift away again, leaving behind the familiar quiet. Those who had served on the jury carried their own private reckoning, some confident they had done the right thing, others less certain, all aware that their decision had altered lives in ways they could never fully measure. They learned that judgment does not end responsibility, it transforms it, turning certainty into something personal rather than public. Law enforcement tracked the case's ripple effects indirectly, changes in reporting behavior, shifts in how missing persons were discussed, a heightened sensitivity to the early signs of disappearance, and while these changes offered a sense of progress, they also underscored the cost at which such awareness had been purchased. Improvement, in this context, felt bittersweet. The physical locations tied to the case evolved, buildings repurposed, roads resurfaced, landscapes altered by time and development, and yet for those who remembered, these places retained an invisible layer, a memory that overlaid the present, turning ordinary spaces into quiet memorials no one had officially designated. The land remembered even when people tried not to. As years accumulated, the cold case became a story told differently depending on who was listening, a lesson in vigilance, a cautionary tale, a failure narrowly corrected, or a justice imperfectly served. Each version revealed something about the teller, about what they needed the case to mean in order to live with it. And, through all of this, one truth remained stubbornly intact, that the moment which set everything in motion, a routine traffic stop on a dark stretch of highway, had been an accident of timing. A reminder that the line between buried past and exposed truth can be thinner than anyone wants to believe. The randomness of that encounter continued to unsettle those who understood its implications, because it suggested that countless other stories might remain hidden simply because chance never intervened. The cold case, closed by law, opened by memory, settled into its final form not as an answer, but as a question carried forward, asking what justice looks like when certainty is incomplete, asking how communities absorb trauma without fully acknowledging it, asking whether knowing part of the truth is better than living with none at all. And in the quiet that followed, that question lingered unanswered, shaping the future just as powerfully as it had shaped the past. The story does not end where the records stop, it never does, because paperwork can close a case, but it cannot close a memory, and long after the files were sealed and the headlines archived, the cold case continued to exist in the spaces no document can reach. It lived in the pauses between conversations, in the way certain questions were never asked aloud anymore, in the collective understanding that something fundamental had been disturbed and could not be fully repaired. People still replayed the beginning, the randomness of it, the red and blue lights on an empty road, the routine traffic stop that peeled back years of silence without intention or mercy, and that moment became almost mythic in hindsight. Not because it was dramatic, but because it proved how fragile concealment really is. One small deviation, one ordinary decision, and the past surfaced, not cleanly, not completely, but enough to change everything. For some, the official ending was enough, a line drawn to protect the future from being consumed by the past, and they chose to accept the verdict as truth, not because it answered every question, but because endless doubt is a heavy thing to carry. For others, acceptance never came, only adaptation, a way of living alongside uncertainty without letting it dominate, a quiet resistance to the idea that complexity must always be simplified. The victim's name endured, no longer shouted in urgency, no longer printed in breaking news banners, but spoken softly, with care, remembered not for how the story ended, but for how abruptly it was taken away. In that remembrance, there was no neat arc, no justice served in full, only the recognition that some losses cannot be balanced by any outcome, legal or otherwise. The town itself absorbed the case into its identity, not proudly, not willingly, but inevitably, becoming a place marked by experience rather than innocence. New generations learn the story indirectly, fragments passed down without dates or details, a sense that something once happened here that changed how people look at one another, how they measure safety, how quickly they trust the familiar. Law enforcement moved on to new cases, new urgencies, but the cold case lingered in institutional memory, a reference point invoked when caution was needed, when patience was required, when someone asked why old files should never be dismissed too easily. It became a quiet instructor, shaping decisions long after its active life had ended. And then there were the nights, the long stretches of quiet when the mind drifts backward despite every effort to move forward, when unresolved stories resurface uninvited. On those nights, the case was not closed at all, it was vivid, immediate, filled with alternative paths and imagined truths, because the human need for certainty does not expire with a verdict. The most unsettling realization came slowly, not all at once, that this story was not exceptional because of what was discovered, but because of how much remained unknown. It stood as proof that answers can be partial, that justice can function without full illumination, and that closure is often something people construct for themselves when institutions reach their limits. In the end, the cold case did what it had always done best. It refused to stay silent without ever fully speaking, existing in a state between revelation and mystery, leaving behind not a solution, but a warning. A warning about how easily truth can hide in plain sight. A warning about how long consequences can wait. A warning that sometimes the past does not demand to be understood, only acknowledged. And so the story fades not with certainty, but with an echo, the knowledge that somewhere between what was proven and what was believed, the real answer still lingers, unrecorded, unconfirmed, and perhaps unreachable. The road where it all began remains just another stretch of pavement to most, but for those who know, it carries a weight invisible to passing headlights, a reminder that even the most ordinary moments can become the doorway through which the past returns, not to resolve itself, but to ensure it is never entirely forgotten. Even after everything that could be said had been said, after the verdict, after the years of distance, the case continued to surface in unexpected ways, not as a headline, but as a feeling, a sudden tightening in the chest when an old road was mentioned, a fleeting recognition in a stranger's face, the quiet thought that some stories never truly conclude, they simply change how they are carried. The cold case became less about what happened and more about what it revealed, about the thin line between the visible and the hidden, between what is known and what is merely assumed. Those who had lived closest to it learned that time does not heal in straight lines. It circles back, it revisits, it reframes, and sometimes it sharpens rather than dulls. A comment overheard years later, a document reread with older eyes, a memory resurfacing without warning, each one had the power to reopen questions thought settled. And yet, there was also a growing understanding that certainty was never the true goal, that what people had been seeking all along was meaning, a way to place the loss within a story that could be lived with. The landscape itself seemed unchanged to outsiders, the same fields, the same roads, the same quiet horizons, but for those who knew, it had acquired a second layer, an invisible map of significance that only memory could read. Ordinary places had become markers, not officially recognized, but deeply felt, reminders that violence does not always announce itself, that it can pass through without leaving scars anyone else can see. Occasionally, someone new would arrive in town, unaware of its history, and ask an innocent question that brushed too close to the past, and the response would be measured, careful, revealing just enough to satisfy curiosity without reopening everything. In those moments, it became clear how much energy it takes to maintain silence, how much work goes into keeping a story from spilling back into the present. The cold case also reshaped how people listened to news from elsewhere, other disappearances, other reopened files, other long-delayed reckonings. Each one felt personal, not because of similarity, but because of recognition, the shared understanding that behind every brief headline lies a depth of uncertainty most will never see. It fostered empathy, but also caution, an awareness that not every mystery resolves cleanly, no matter how desperately resolution is wanted. And sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet enough to hear old thoughts clearly, the beginning would return again, that first unnoticed moment when everything was still normal, when no one knew they were standing at the edge of a story that would stretch across decades. That realization carried its own kind of ache, the knowledge that significance is almost always invisible in real time. In this way, the cold case never truly closed. It simply receded into a deeper place, woven into the town's collective memory, influencing decisions without announcing itself, shaping instincts without explanation. It stood as a reminder not of one act alone, but of the long shadow actions cast, and of how truth, even when partially revealed, can alter lives in ways no verdict can fully account for. There was no final image, no definitive answer waiting just beyond reach, only the steady persistence of a question that had learned how to survive without resolution. And perhaps that was the final legacy of the case, not the exposure of a killer, not the closing of a file, but the enduring understanding that some truths do not arrive to be solved, they arrive to be endured, carried forward quietly, shaping the present while reminding everyone who remembers that the past is never as distant as it appears. The story lingered not because it demanded attention, but because it refused to release it, a presence that no longer shouted yet never fully fell silent, like a radio left on low volume in an empty room. Years after the last official statement, after the last press conference lights went dark, people still spoke about the case in lowered voices, not out of fear, but out of habit, as if the mystery itself had taught them how to speak carefully, how to leave space between words. The cold case lived on in that space, in the pauses, in the moments when a sentence trailed off before reaching its conclusion. Those closest to it learned that endings are often administrative, not emotional. A file can be stamped, a name can be written in ink, but the human mind does not accept closure on command. It revisits, it replays, it edits scenes that can no longer be changed. The smallest details remain the most stubborn: the sound of gravel under tires, the color of the sky that morning, the way time seemed to slow just before everything fractured. These details carried more weight than any official explanation ever could. In the wider world, the case faded into statistics, one among thousands, another example cited in reports about unresolved crimes, systemic failures, the limits of certainty. But for those who remembered, it was never abstract. It was tactile. It was the weight of unanswered questions pressing against ordinary days, turning routine moments into sudden reminders that something vital had once slipped through unnoticed. There was a strange discipline that developed around remembering, a balance between honoring what was lost and refusing to let the loss define everything that followed. People learned how to live beside the mystery rather than inside it. They learned which roads to take and which to avoid, which anniversaries to acknowledge quietly, which conversations to redirect before they went too far. This was not denial. It was survival. Occasionally, someone would claim to have a theory, a new interpretation, a final missing piece, and for a brief moment, the old tension would return, hearts lifting and tightening at the same time. But the excitement never lasted. Experience had taught caution. The case had promised answers too many times before. Hope, once burned, becomes careful, measured, almost shy. What remained undeniable was the way the case reshaped perception. After it, nothing seemed entirely ordinary. A broken taillight, a car parked too long at the roadside, a stranger asking a simple question, each carried the faint echo of possibility. Not paranoia, but awareness. A recognition that the line between safety and danger is thinner than anyone wants to believe. As the years continued to move forward, the case gradually transformed from a question into a warning, from a search for truth into a lesson about fragility. It reminded those who listened that stories do not always resolve according to narrative logic, that reality is indifferent to neat conclusions, that sometimes the most honest ending is an open one. And so the cold case settled into its final form, not as a solved mystery or an unsolved one, but as a permanent imprint on the collective memory of a place and its people. It existed as a shadow cast long after the source had disappeared, shaping choices, sharpening instincts, whispering its presence in moments of unexpected quiet. There was no final revelation waiting just beyond the horizon, no dramatic turn left to uncover. Only the steady understanding that some stories endure precisely because they resist completion. They stay not to torment, but to remind, to insist that what happened mattered, that it still matters, and that even in silence, the unanswered can continue to speak. Time continued its quiet work, smoothing the sharpest edges while leaving the shape intact, and with each passing year the case slipped further from public conversation yet deeper into private consciousness, a paradox that defined its afterlife. People no longer needed to name it outright. A look, a pause, a half-finished sentence was enough. The cold case had become a shared reference point, a silent agreement that some experiences mark a before and an after, even when no one says so aloud. Children who had not been born when it happened grew up sensing it anyway, absorbing fragments through overheard conversations, through the way adults reacted to certain questions, through rules that seemed excessive until they weren't. Don't stop on that road. Lock the doors earlier than necessary. Trust your instincts even when they feel impolite. The case became a curriculum without a classroom, lessons passed down not through facts, but through behavior. For those who once worked closest to the investigation, the passage of time brought its own reckoning. Careers ended, files were boxed and archived, faces in photographs grew unfamiliar even to themselves. And yet, the mind returned, uninvited, to the same unresolved points, the same decisions made under pressure, the same moments where a different choice might have altered everything. Retirement did not erase responsibility. It merely removed the distraction of routine, leaving space for reflection to grow louder. The evidence, what remained of it, aged differently. Paper yellowed. Tapes degraded. Labels faded. But questions stayed sharp. Each item carried the weight of what it failed to say, what it hinted at but never confirmed. The cold case was not defined by what was missing, but by what persisted without context, fragments suspended in uncertainty. In the community, memorials took subtle forms. No plaques. No official ceremonies. Just habits. A light left on. A name avoided. A certain song turned off when it came on the radio. These gestures were not meant to solve anything. They were acknowledgments, small acts of respect for a wound that had never fully closed. From time to time, an outsider would stumble upon the story, drawn in by a headline or a passing reference, and approach it with fresh energy, convinced that distance had created clarity. They would ask why no one had seen what now seemed obvious, why the truth had been allowed to drift for so long. The answers were always incomplete. Because clarity, in hindsight, is a privilege the present never affords. The cold case also altered how the community understood justice. It challenged the idea that every wrong is balanced by accountability, that every crime arrives with a corresponding resolution. Instead, it introduced a more uncomfortable truth, that justice is sometimes partial, sometimes delayed, sometimes symbolic rather than complete. And learning to live with that truth required a different kind of strength. As years stacked quietly on top of one another, the case lost its urgency but not its gravity. It no longer demanded action, but it continued to exert influence, pulling thoughts back, shaping reactions, reminding those who remembered that absence can be as powerful as presence. The unanswered became a constant companion, not hostile, not friendly, simply there. In the end, the cold case did what few stories manage to do. It refused to end, not out of defiance, but out of honesty. It mirrored life as it is lived, unresolved, uneven, resistant to clean lines. And in that refusal, it left behind something enduring, a shared awareness that some truths are not discovered, but carried, quietly, carefully, for as long as memory lasts. By the time the story reached this stage of its life, it no longer belonged to the moment of the crime or even to the investigation that followed. It belonged to time itself, stretched thin and woven through decades of ordinary living. The cold case existed less as an event and more as a condition, a quiet distortion in how the past and present interacted, a reminder that some moments refused to stay where they happened. People noticed how memory behaved around it, how it rearranged itself without permission. Certain details grew sharper instead of fading, while others dissolved completely, leaving gaps that could never be filled. What remained was not a coherent narrative, but a mosaic of impressions, each one incomplete on its own, yet collectively heavy. The mind tried to organize them, to impose order, but the case resisted structure. It had taught everyone that chaos does not always resolve into clarity. There were nights when former witnesses woke suddenly, convinced they had remembered something important, a sound, a movement, a face at the edge of perception. By morning, the certainty was gone, leaving only frustration and the faint embarrassment of having nothing concrete to offer. These moments were never reported. They stayed private, another layer of silence added to an already crowded space. The physical traces of the case continued to disappear. Buildings were renovated. Lots were cleared. Roads were widened. What had once been preserved, intentionally or not, was absorbed back into utility. To an outsider, the transformation suggested progress, renewal. To those who knew, it felt like erasure, not of the crime itself, but of the context that once made questions feel urgent. The cold case had to survive without landmarks. And yet, despite everything that had been lost to time, the emotional residue remained intact. It surfaced unexpectedly, in conversations about unrelated tragedies, in reactions that felt disproportionate until traced back to their source. The case had sensitized people to vulnerability, made them acutely aware of how quickly stability can fracture. It was not fear that lingered, but vigilance, a sharpened attention to the fragile mechanics of everyday life. For some, The case became a reference point for morality, a reminder that certainty is often an illusion, that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. It challenged simplistic ideas about right and wrong, about heroes and failures. The investigation had been populated by ordinary people doing what they believed was best with the information they had. That realization complicated judgment and softened blame, replacing anger with something closer to resignation. The cold case also influenced how stories were told afterward. There was a reluctance to dramatize, to impose false resolution where none existed. People spoke carefully, avoiding definitive language, resisting the temptation to shape the past into something more manageable than it truly was. The case had taught them the cost of premature conclusions, the danger of mistaking narrative satisfaction for truth. As technology advanced, offering new tools and new hopes, the case occasionally resurfaced in speculation. Could modern methods reveal what older ones could not? Could data fill the gaps memory had left behind? These questions flared briefly, then dimmed. Each generation learned the same lesson in its own way, that not every mystery is waiting for the right innovation, that some are defined by absence rather than concealment. What endured most powerfully was the sense of proximity, the understanding that the extraordinary often hides within the ordinary. The case had not unfolded in a distant place or under extreme circumstances. It had emerged from routine, from familiarity, from assumptions that safety was a given. That proximity made it impossible to dismiss, impossible to relegate fully to the past. In quiet moments, the case felt less like a story and more like a presence, not threatening, not demanding, simply existing alongside everything else. It did not insist on attention, yet it never vanished. It was there in the way people listened more closely, questioned more carefully, hesitated before certainty. The cold case had altered the internal rhythm of a community, slowing it just enough to notice what might otherwise be missed. And so it continued, not forward, not backward, but outward, expanding